Hi, everybody. We're just going to give it 2 more minutes before we begin, just to let everyone else join. Feel free to let me know in the chat box if you're able to see and hear me okay. And also feel free to let me know where you're joining from today. Okay, so hi, everyone, and thank you for attending today. So we're going to get started now as we're just on the hour. It's 10 o'clock here in Galway, but I can see there's people joining from a number of different countries here. So today we're going to get started, and this webinar is going to be on getting started with API standardization in SwaggerHub. Now, to begin, we have our hosts today. So my name is Adrian Minnock, and I'm a solutions engineer here within SmartBear. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Joseph Joyce. So Joe, you can introduce yourself there?
Thank you, Adrian. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Like Adrian said, my name is Joseph Joyce, and I am also working on the solutions engineering team with SmartBear on our API tools. So Red API and also SwaggerHub, which we'll be taking a look at this morning. So good to speak to you all.
Perfect. Now, we're coming to you from Galway. Once again, we're coming to you from our own homes separately. So we're getting used to this new structure as well of working from home and presenting from home. But
yeah, it's a little bit of an adjustment. My neighbors have been hearing me talk a lot about SwaggerHub, and they're really curious to know what it is I'm actually talking about. So
they must be experts now in API design.
they know all about it now. They know all about it now.
Okay, so I suppose just before jumping into to the agenda, a couple of things just to take note of. If you do have any questions at all throughout the demonstration today or throughout the webinar, feel free to post those into the Q&A section of the toolbar. So there should be, in the middle, there should be a Q&A section, and just feel free to post all your questions in there. We'll try and get to those and have a bit of a Q&A at the end. Also, with regards the webinar itself, this will be recorded, and anybody who has registered for it, you will receive the recording of today's webinar as well as the slides. Okay, so that's a bit of the housekeeping out of the way. So with regards to today's agenda, we've gone through a bit of an introduction. We're going to go through standardization and why this is critical within the API design. We're going to talk through quality and how we can define that quality within your teams. We're also going to go through the challenges involved with regards that API or OAS design and development process when you begin to scale within your organization. And then we're going to take a look at, from those challenges, how SwaggerHub can address those and help. And then, as we mentioned, at the end, we'll hopefully have time for a Q&A, so we'll be able to try and get to some of those questions that you might have throughout the webinar. Okay, so I suppose as an introduction here, just a small bit about SmartBear. So SmartBear is an organization, so we provide tools for development, testing, operations teams to basically create great software faster than ever. So we implement those. Myself and Joe, we'd mainly work with regards the API tool set for design, documentation, testing, virtualization. But within SmartBear, we would provide tools across a full tool set or product lifecycle. Now, SmartBear, you can see here, it's a very large company. We have 7 global offices. Myself and Joe work in the Galway office within Ireland. And SmartBear itself was founded in 2009. So SmartBear, you might be familiar, you mightn't have realized it was SmartBear, but some of the tools, some of the open source tools such as Swagger and SoapUI, SmartBear would have been behind those. And then on the right-hand side, you can see some other tools, which would be for, let's say, API and UI design, testing. You might be familiar with some of those. So to take a more in-depth look here at SmartBear's product portfolio, we can see at the top, we have our UI tools. So we have some for design and also UI testing. And then at the bottom, we have our API layer. So we have SwaggerHub, which we're going to be looking at today. So SwaggerHub would be used for the API design. Then we also have tools here for API testing and monitoring. And then we also work with tools for deployment and then CI integrations or commits. Okay, so why is standardization critical? So SmartBear was involved in generating a state of API report in 2019. And this state of API report involved speaking to a number of API practitioners and organizations. So this will be with regards to the design, documentation, testing, and development of those APIs. And essentially, this report was to identify different trends and practices within the market. So if we take a more in-depth look into this, one thing that was evident from this report is that quality is king. And this kept coming up. It was the same the year before, but with regards API consumers, they were expecting efficient, high performance services. So, and from speaking to developers and API designers on calls and at conferences, this is something that the communication with the consumers and what they deliver, it needs to be of a very extremely high quality in order for this to work as expected and not to impact with regards the, let's say, revenue or consumers. So we can see here some figures. So within this report, API developers recognized that the quality was a top priority. We can see 41% say that was extremely important, while a 78.5% were saying that was very important or higher. So we can see from this was one of the main trends, that the quality was one of the key areas to be addressed when creating the API designs or the development of those APIs. And this is going to feed into how can we improve this quality. So we can also see here that, and this is one of the key areas or key factors to come out of this report, is that the results of the poor quality APIs, it has extremely real consequences. So poor quality APIs can have a huge impact on a business. So 45% relate poor quality to the loss of customers, and also 48% worry about damaging company reputation. So those two pieces alone are what's driving a lot of the standardization and increase in quality within these APIs. The loss of customers and damaging a company reputation it could have a huge impact on the organization, on revenue, and on future revenue, especially if the reputation is damaged. Standards, so being able to enforce quality standards. We have here, this was a couple of areas as well. So standardization was one of the key, or the number one challenge teams are looking to overcome in the new year. So how they can implement those standardization to improve the quality. Versioning, so with regards to versioning, how they can easily create versions, how they can catalog these versions and make sure that the newest version of a definition is being used, and that they're able to just ensure basically that those API definitions are able to manage, and the developers are going to be able to create and use the correct version. Apologies, the correct version. We also have here that over 50% of organizations use or plan on using internal style guidelines. This is quite a common approach that we're seeing quite lately, that a lot of companies, they mightn't have style guidelines in place at the moment, but they're starting to come up with a list of guidelines that they want their API definitions to follow. And then we have that style guidelines were important or higher for over 50% of respondents. So we can see that on the right-hand side here. And as I mentioned, more and more companies are trying to find out what those key elements within their APIs are and how they can make those more consistent or standardize those.
And I think like a lot of, like a lot of software testing, and when you think about trying to make sure that software is doing a certain thing or complying to a certain rule, the earlier that you start having those conversations, the better. So the earlier you start talking about specifically in a technical sense, what are the standards that an API is eventually going to need to comply with, the better. So it's the easier it's going to be to actually make sure that when the code is actually written, you're complying with these rules. So, in our view, as we'll see now in a second, it makes sense to start talking about these things right from the get-go. So right from the start of the design phase, to start thinking about how you're actually going to implement these standards.
Yeah, exactly, Joe. Okay, so here we have defining quality within your team. So this area looks at a couple of different components. We have the OAS, so being able to use the Open API specification, which is, the Open API specification is used for the design of RESTful APIs, and this will be the industry standard. So SmartBear would be a leader in this, and we are quite heavily involved with the Open API initiative. So this is one key area that we would see a lot of people beginning to say, if they're moving from SOAP or legacy APIs, they might be moving now to RESTful APIs and looking to implement a standard. So the Open API specification would be the most common approach for this. We then have shifting left. So creating those definitions in the OAS format, this can help shift left, which basically means getting that testing done at an earlier stage. So to do this, we're able to reuse those definitions. So we have that definition-driven approach. We're able to reuse those definitions. We're able to virtualize and begin our testing at an earlier stage without having the dependency on our development being completed. So this allows us to begin our testing, have that done, and it means that we have higher quality testing whenever we're ready to begin testing against the developed API. We then have the reusable components. So obviously, wherever we're able to reuse components within our APIs for, let's say, the design or development is going to be crucial. Now, we're going to be able to show you how we can efficiently reuse those components. We also have, let's say, definitions, virtual services, and code snippets. And we're going to be able to talk through this, and Joe's going to be able to, let's say, talk through this within the actual tool itself. And then the last area we have is with regards document and consumer. So with regards to this, we're going to be able to create and have that quality with regards to our documentations and be able to pass that into or over to our consumers for those API definitions. We would see this like quite a common approach with regards our contract testing, where we need that documentation to be of a very high quality. Phase will be having those individual developers or designers creating the open API definitions. So this will be quite, let's say, an individual process. They'd be working by themselves, creating their APIs or creating that API design, and then generating the definitions from that. From there, we might want to start incorporating. So as, let's say, an organization or a company begins to grow, we might start incorporating different teams within this. So from here, now that we have different teams, different designers or developers working on creating those definitions, we now need to have, or we might need to start implementing some standards or some style guidelines just to ensure that those API definitions or designs are going to be in line. They're all going to be following the same design rules, and we're going to have some standards across all APIs. And then phase 3, you can see here, we're going to be bringing in new processes and tools to be implemented. So we could be starting to integrate, we could be getting advanced with our API design process. We could be implementing some integrations with API gateways, source control tools, our CI/CD pipelines, and we could have our standardization included in this. So we're now going to be moving across or working across multiple teams within the organization, could be speaking or collaborating with external consumers, and we're going to have to use tools to help ease those processes. Now, there's a couple of key challenges with regards to the development or OAS development. So one of the most common ones that I come across would be that there might be too many versions or too many specifications in too many places. And I suppose without a proper structure, it's okay for a smaller company or organization as they begin to design and develop those APIs. But as you start to scale and start to generate more and more APIs, and you're creating those definitions, and you have to create different versions, being able to store, catalog those, and be able to reference the correct ones and search for the correct API definitions and have that reusability. That's one of the main challenges we'd see people experiencing. So they need a place where they can, let's say, a single source of truth, where they can catalog all of their API definitions. Everyone can go in, search for a definition or a domain, and from there, they'll be able to access those and then add in any functionality or methods that they need to. The second challenge would be relating to the collaboration. So the too many people involved that need to collaborate. Once again, if you don't have your API definitions stored within an area where everybody can access them, view them, and collaborate, you run the risk of people, let's say, making changes to one definition, that not being aligned with what's going into development, and just not having that overall collaboration between your team, that efficient collaboration. The next will be the loss of control and visibility. As we mentioned earlier, having those teams, multiple teams working together and collaborating on API definitions, or even having different designers working on different definitions. You want to ensure that there's standardization between all of those definitions that are being created and that design process. So the loss of control here, as you start to grow and have more people working on that design process. And then the last point here is integrating API development into an existing delivery pipeline. So if we're generating these definitions or any code from them, how can we have that integrated into our delivery pipelines? So there are the 4 key challenges that that will be common throughout a lot of the organizations that we would speak to. Now, to address these, SwaggerHub, I suppose to take a step back, SwaggerHub is a tool, or it's a platform that ties all of the open source tools together. So people might be familiar, or they might be using one or some of these open source tools. But within the open source community, we have Swagger UI, which is used to generate documentation for our API definitions. We have Swagger Editor, which is used, it's a code editor, which allows you to generate or create that definition. And then we have Swagger CodeGen, and that's used to generate server stubs, client SDKs, or definitions from that documentation, from that API definition. So we have those 3 open source tools. SwaggerHub ties all of those tools together within the one platform, but then it also adds in additional layers for standardization and collaboration. So we can see here, SwaggerHub ties all the open source tools together. It also creates that single source of truth for your APIs. So within one space, you'd be able to store and catalog all your API definitions together. And then you can provide access to team members or consumers that need to access that documentation. And then it also provides a structure and guidance across teams. So potentially you could have different teams that need to access different APIs. They might need to have standardization checks, those style guidelines. SwaggerHub allows you to build out and have that structure within the platform. So you can store your definitions in different areas. You can also provide access to your teams within those areas. So we've talked very briefly there about SwaggerHub. But I suppose if we want to address the challenges that we mentioned previously, the first one was with regards having too many versions of too many definitions in too many areas. So within SwaggerHub, we have one platform, and you're able to store your API definitions within here. Now, as we store or catalog our API definitions, we can very easily generate new versions of our APIs from here. So rather than having to generate, let's say if it was outside of the platform, having to generate multiple files, we can just very easily generate new versions and maintain those within SwaggerHub. We can also do checks and compare different versions against each other. So this allows teams to work together very easily. It allows us to resolve issues. I suppose one of the main reasons for having a platform where multiple teams can work together and, let's say, review and collaborate and have that standardization is that it allows us to find any errors within or any issues within our API definitions at an earlier stage. So being able to find this at the design phase rather than when it's gone into development and we have to change code means that it's going to be no real cost to us, and you don't have developers having to go in and change the actual code within the development. So we can see here on the right hand side, we have a chart relating to that and the cost that it'll take at each stage when we need to make any changes. The second challenge was with regards involved a collaboration. So allowing different team members to collaborate, share, and work on those API definitions. So we can see here we have cross-functional feedback. Different team members can come in, review, leave comments, and we can assign permissions to those.
And just one thing I might add there, Adrian, this relates to a question that's come in from Raphael. So Raphael asked if we had any kind of graphical tool for designing, and I assume he means like the writing the definition. I think that kind of relates to challenge 2 quite well, is because with some tools, or if you're not using a tool at all for your API design, if you're jumping in straight into the code and just starting to develop, you lose out on the input of key stakeholders who might have some very valuable insights into what the API should be doing, who the customers are, what exactly they're looking for from the system once it's developed. So we'll take a look at this in a second once we're looking at the platform. But SwaggerHub has, obviously the code editor, if you want, so the YAML editor, where you can actually just jump in and start writing YAML syntax and writing your definition like that. But there's also a visual editor. There's a visual editor that lets you update the API information without necessarily having to worry about the YAML syntax. And the idea is that that's a way to kind of address that challenge too, where you're trying to get as many of the key stakeholders involved as early as possible, so that you're not missing out on an insight. If you start with development, you might lose out on some input from someone more business focused, and that might only become apparent as an issue once maybe there's a version of the API or a version of the app or system already been developed, so time has already been sank into it, and then someone turns around and says, well, actually, this shouldn't have been implemented that way, because what we really need is X, whereas you've given me Y. So yes, so SwaggerHub has kind of a long-winded answer to your question there, Raphael, but SwaggerHub does have a couple of ways to make sure that everyone who needs to be involved with the design can be involved with the design.
Yeah, and I can see there's another question in here with regards to style guidelines, and giving an example of what is meant by those style guidelines. So within the challenge 3 here, with regards to the loss of control and visibility, within SwaggerHub, you'll be able to implement your own style guidelines or rules, which means that, for instance, if you wanted to implement a rule to say that every API definition must have a 200 response, you would be able to implement that, and then it'll give back an error if your API definition isn't following these rules. So it's just an easy way of being able to define a list of rules in which that the design of your API must follow. So we'll be able to go through this, and Joe will be able to show you an example. But we also have here the ability to create a library of reusable assets. So these will be domains within SwaggerHub. And it means that you can define different components within your definitions and then reuse those. So you can just reference those within your definitions. And then the last challenge will be the ability to integrate your development into existing delivery pipelines. So within SwaggerHub, we have native integrations available for API gateways. If you want to update the proxy in your API gateway, you can have an integration set up. So Apogee, we can see on the right-hand side, that will be one of the main gateways that we would integrate with, or one of the main examples that we would have. We're also able to integrate with source control tools as well. So for instance, GitLab, GitHub, Bitbucket, Azure DevOps, all of those, we'd be able to have integration set up for those source control tools. And then we would also have the ability to use webhooks and a registry API as well in order to have or perform functions as part of a CI/CD pipeline outside of, let's say, the tool itself. So from here, we're just going to move into the demonstration now. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment. And Joe will be able to just show you how we can address these different challenges within the tool, within SwaggerHub.
That's great. Thank you, Adrian. Let me just fumble around here for a second. Now, so same as before, if anybody is having any issues hearing me or seeing my screen, shoot something into the chat there, and we can take a look. Hopefully you are all looking at the same thing that I'm looking at, which is SwaggerHub and the My Hub view. All good. Thank you, Evan. Appreciate it. Excellent. So this is SwaggerHub. So SwaggerHub, as we've kind of been working up to during this webinar, is SmartBear's platform for collaborating on API definitions to make sure that you end up implementing something that is, you know, as close or hopefully exactly what was agreed upon at the design stage, something that complies with any standards or any rules you might need it to comply with. So SwaggerHub, there's a SaaS version of the tool, there's an on-prem version of the tool, but from a kind of designer point of view, and I mean designer as someone who's logging into SwaggerHub and actually working on definitions and updating them and adding information into the YAML. From a designer point of view, that journey is pretty similar. So I mean, just to take you through an example of a kind of user journey, you know, I'm the user Joe Joyce. I log into my company's instance of SwaggerHub. Maybe I've been assigned a Jira ticket that, hey Joe, we need you to update the Swagger Pet Store definition. We're making a change. We want to make a change, and we're doing design first. So can we start by making a change on the API definition? So I say, yeah, sure thing. Open up SwaggerHub and have a look through the catalog of APIs that I have access to. So what a user will see here kind of will depend on the access that they've been given. So you can see, if I scroll over to the left-hand side, so this is my hub, and a user's My Hub view is just an unfiltered list of all the API definitions and domains that they have access to. And I'll explain domains in a bit more detail in a second. But you also have the option to organize your API definitions into organizations. So you can see here, I'm a member of 3 organizations: the domain APIs, system APIs, and external APIs organization. And within those organizations, there's these subfolders called projects. And these are just another filter that you can apply. So if I click on domain APIs, I will only see the APIs that are part of that organization. And then if I click on this subfolder, I'll only see a smaller list of those APIs. So one thing that SwaggerHub does, you know, Adrian took us through that phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 of API development, you know, and the idea was that as you went up the scale, as you got closer to phase 3, maybe things were becoming a bit more challenging because you've got more people, more teams, and more definitions that need to be worked on. So it would make sense to have a way to organize those definitions and kind of group related APIs together and group related teams together. And that's one thing that SwaggerHub does very well from a collaboration point of view, is you can organize your APIs and your domains together in a logical way that might be related to how they're organized kind of conceptually in the real world or within your organization. And you can build workflows into that as well, so that an API might start in one organization and work will be done here. It might get passed to another and then to another until it's published, until it reaches the end of its life cycle in SwaggerHub. But that's a little bit on how you can organize your API definitions together in SwaggerHub. So to jump back into the story, I've been tasked with making a change to an API, and I can open up my organization and I see here's my Swagger pet store, and I'll fire that up, and you'll see the workspace that you're probably going to spend most of your time in as a designer in SwaggerHub, right? So this is your main workspace, and anybody who has used any of the open source tools is probably going to recognize a couple of elements of the UI here. So you have front and center. This is an API definition in SwaggerHub. So an API definition in SwaggerHub, it's a YAML file that is OAS compliant, and it is describing what the eventual functionality of the API is going to be. And in a design first type of workflow, this is what happens first before any code gets written. So we're all collaborating and leaving comments for each other in SwaggerHub, working on a definition together. And kind of figuring out what exactly the API needs to do once it's being written. And the idea is, as we saw with some of the data that Adrian took us through, it's going to be cheaper and fingers crossed, less stressful to kind of discuss these ideas and figure out what works and what doesn't work at this stage and make changes to a couple of lines of YAML than it might be once someone started on like the server implementation of an API. Then it might become a little bit more difficult to make these changes. So the idea is that you collaborate here in SwaggerHub, you make the changes to the API definition, and then when that's finished, you use that to prompt development activity or prompt testing activity or change something in production, for example. So front and center in the UI is the actual definition. On the right-hand side, you've got your auto-generated documentation. So another thing that SwaggerHub does is that as you make changes to your API definition, the YAML here in the middle, you're also automatically generating documentation, and documentation that would be intended to be used by a developer who needs to use the API eventually, or a consumer. So I said a designer earlier as a type of user in SwaggerHub who needs to be able to make changes here to the YAML. Whereas a consumer who I just referenced might be someone who just needs to understand the functionality of an API using SwaggerHub. They might not necessarily need to actually make changes to it. So consumer is another type of user, and these are the type of users that are collaborating with each other in SwaggerHub. So a consumer might be more interested in the documentation on the right-hand side there. So I can take a look here and choose a particular operation or resource and understand a little bit more about it. What do I need to provide as an input? And what type of responses can I expect back from that endpoint, for example? But the name of the game today is standardization, and we're here to talk more so about how SwaggerHub helps you enforce standardization as early as possible. So what I'll do is I'll pull this documentation over a little bit. So you can see that there's a lot of red on the screen right now. So something's not exactly right with this definition. And I'm being notified of that by the validator down here in the bottom of the IDE type view. And this is doing a couple of things. So what it's doing, first of all, is it's making sure that the YAML that I'm writing is valid OAS, right? Because, as Adrian told us, SwaggerHub, at its foundation, it's really based on the OpenAPI specification. You're using SwaggerHub to write OpenAPI definitions that are hopefully going to be valid OpenAPI as per the OpenAPI specification. So the validator here is going to tell you if you write YAML that is not compliant with the OpenAPI specification. So that's one type of standardization that SwaggerHub helps you achieve, is that if you're starting off here, if you were to create an API definition from scratch and start with a blank screen here, from the second you start writing your first line of YAML, that validator is going to tell you whether or not your definition is valid OpenAPI spec, which, is obviously, if you're using SwaggerHub, you're going to want to make sure that your definitions are valid OAS. So that's one kind of standardization that SwaggerHub does. On the other hand, so if I go back here, you can see that a lot of the APIs that I have access to have errors here flagged against them. And the notification I'm getting, it's things like, it's a standardization error. So for the Swagger Pet Store, for example, I can save the API with this error, but I can't publish it. So the idea of publishing an API in SwaggerHub is an important one. And I'll just pull up a slide very quickly. The idea is that you publish an API definition in SwaggerHub when it reaches the end of its, of a particular process or a workflow. So if I pull this up for a second, this is a design first type workflow. So right now, to stick with my story, I got assigned my Jira ticket here, logged into SwaggerHub, started working on a definition. And this loop here is where the commenting is happening. This is where the standardization checks are happening. And usually, ideally, when an API definition is deemed to be ready to be moved on to the next stage, at this green tick, that's usually where it's going to be published. And as far as SwaggerHub is concerned, that's just a simple changing of a value for an API, right? So I open up an API here. I can change it from published. I can change it to unpublished. Now, once an API is published, it becomes read-only, and publishing can also trigger some of the integration. So if I've got an integration set up that's connecting to a source control tool and pushing code and pushing the definition there, publishing will often trigger that. But where standardization is concerned, if I have set up standardization rules for an organization, right? So you set up standardization rules at the org level, meaning that, for my system APIs organization, any APIs that I have within that org, if I want to apply standardization rules to them, I open up the organization settings and I go into standardization. So there's two branches to standardization rules in SwaggerHub. The first, these are out of the box rules that we define. And they relate to API info, they relate to operations, and they relate to models within your definitions. So these are rules that you can apply to many API definitions at once. And you're basically saying things like, I want to make sure that if a designer adds a new operation to an API definition in SwaggerHub, it must always have at least one 200 response. Right? So I think we'd agree, kind of common sense. If you're adding an operation to an API, it would make sense that, if that's a logical operation, there should be a good response and a bad response. So there should be a 200 response. It might be a fairly straightforward thing to make sure that that's done if you're talking about just a handful of developers, one or two devs at that phase 1 stage that Adrian showed us earlier. But when you start to scale that up, when you start to get towards the phase 3 type model, that could become a little bit more cumbersome, because now you've got many teams, many team members, and many APIs, and you're essentially just leaving it up to chance that, with the best will in the world, someone might forget to add a 200 response. And then if that makes it through, if that slips through the process and that makes it to the dev stage, a dev might say, well, there was no 200 response in the definition, so I didn't implement it, and now there's an API out there that for some reason is only returning 404s. It's kind of a worst case scenario, right? So you can see how it kind of, it extrapolates out a little bit when you move from design to development and then eventually to production. So the idea is you want to put these checks and balances in place as early as possible. So from a designer or from a developer point of view, if this rule is applied at the design stage and I'm working on my definition in SwaggerHub, if I try to add an operation that doesn't have a 200 response or doesn't have a default response, I'm going to be notified of it here, right? And depending on the severity of the rule, I may not be able to save or publish the API definition with that mistake there. So you're essentially just making sure that an API definition isn't going to be able to move through a particular stage in the process unless it's complying with all your standards rules. And for the out-of-the-box rules, it's as simple as just checking a box, right? So you're checking a box for things like make sure there's a 200 response, make sure there's a default response, make sure there's an operation description. From the info level, you're talking about things like making sure that there is an API license present, making sure that an API has a title. Or for a model, if you're using data models within your definitions, you might want to make sure that all model properties always have an example. So just best practice type things, but you're now kind of, you're automating them to a degree. You're automating the check that an API definition meets those requirements.
sorry, Joe,
Yeah,
that's
go
one
ahead.
thing. Just when you mentioned you're automating this process,
Mm.
it's kind of a key word, because you might have come across this as well, but I've come across organizations that have been trying to implement style guidelines similar to this, but it's been quite a manual process where somebody has to review the definitions to ensure that they are meeting these style guidelines, which obviously can be quite a manual process and eat up a lot of time. So having this automated, it can help, and let's say give back a lot of time to any managers or anybody who's going to be or who was reviewing these definitions manually.
Yeah, exactly. You're freeing up a team member's valuable time, right? Because it's obviously an essential thing. You need to make sure that someone technical is taking a look to make sure that these rules are being met, right? It's not necessarily a kind of a straightforward or easy thing to do, but it could very well be a case where that person's time could be better spent on something else, on testing more critical features of something that's closer to production, for example, any number of scenarios. Exactly, that's exactly it. And this kind of ties into one of the questions that came in earlier about exactly what type of standards we're talking about. And this is it, right? So, well, this is one side of it. These are the rules that that are there for you straight out of the box, straight from the get-go. You also have these custom rules, right? So custom rules are a little bit different. So I'm going to open up another organization here. So custom rules are just that, right? They're rules that you can write yourself, and they work in the same way. They are checked in the same way that these out of the box rules are checked. You're going to see them flag in the IDE. You're going to see them flagged in red if they're broken. But in terms of what a custom rule can be, it can be a lot of different things, right? So it comes down to regular expressions, and it comes down to specifying what part of the definition you want to validate. Okay, so it really just boils down to, if you can boil down the standardization check that you want to do into a regular expression, you can tell SwaggerHub to automatically check that for 10, 50, 100 APIs at a time, API definitions at a time. So what this, just to give you an example, this is probably one of the more lengthy regular expressions, but what this is doing is it's checking to make sure that a particular value in the definition, a particular line in the definition, in this case the version number, is semantically versioned, right? So it's not necessarily that pretty, but believe it or not, this is checking to make sure that whatever value is at this part of the definition file, this part of the YAML, is semantically versioned, right? So major, minor, patch. That's probably one of the more complex examples. If I get rid of that for a second, we can take a look at something maybe a little bit more straightforward. So when you're setting up a custom rule, first thing you do, the best thing to do really is to import an existing API so you can see what the rule is actually going to do when it's run on an API definition. So if I choose this pet store interface, we'll import that in. So when you import an API into the custom rule editor, you'll see the whole thing down in the try it out view. And I say whole thing, I mean all of the YAML, all of that definition file. So you run your rules against an entire definition. So the first thing that's important is the path. So you're just saying, what line of the definition do I want to run my check on? So let's say I want to write a rule that's going to check and see what OpenAPI version this definition is. Let's say we want to make sure that all APIs in SwaggerHub must be OAS 3.0, right? So we'll call it OpenAPI version check. So the first thing I need to do is say, this is the part of the file I need to validate. And as I enter the path here, the try it out view filters so I can see exactly what value is going to be checked with the rule. So I'm saying check the OpenAPI value. And then the regular expression comes into play. So as you saw a second ago, you can get if you've got a regex wizard on your team, then that can be very useful here in terms of condensing a rule into something that can be checked with a regular expression. If it's just as straightforward as making sure that a particular path is equal to a certain value, you can just tick this box and say it must match something. So keep it simple. So if I want to say make sure that this value or this path matches 3.0.0, can put that in here and we can see this particular definition meets that rule, so no error, right? However, and I'm just entering in an error message here, so you can customize the error message that will flag. If I change that, and let's say that the rule was checking to see if the OpenAPI version is 2.0, you can enter 2, and we can see that now this fails. So that's probably one of the most simple custom rules that you can apply. Just to give you an idea, and again, to tie back to that question that came in on the chat, where are these standardization rules coming from? So that will depend entirely on the industry that you're in, how your team works, what maybe, from a legal perspective, what do your APIs need to do from a legal perspective once they're actually released? How will they handle certain data? How will certain data be represented in your APIs, right? So it really depends. It's a very, very broad question. Like we work with a lot of fintech organizations who are using custom rules to make sure that their API definitions are compliant with certain ISO standards, right? So for example, unfortunately, don't ask me what the number is off the top of my head, but one of the many delightful ISO standards relates to how country codes are represented in an API. So there's a custom rule. I've seen teams write custom rules to make sure that the country code is being represented in a certain way. So two capital letters, 2 letters like TE for Germany, for example. And that's the type of thing that, it may seem trivial and, it may not seem that important or that difficult to do, but if you're getting that check in place from the word go at the design stage, and you're using design first, for example, so you might be starting with the definition in SwaggerHub and then using one of our integrations to generate code, push that to a source control tool where your developer is then going to actually start building it. If you've made sure that country codes are being handled in a certain way in the definition, you're not going to generate a stub that's going to tell the developer to implement it in a different way, right? So you're kind of testing these things in a way. SwaggerHub isn't a testing tool per se, but you're kind of making sure that your definition meets certain rules before you use it to prompt development activity or before you use it to generate test cases, for example. Because really what SwaggerHub does, amongst a lot of other things, as you've hopefully seen during this session, is it allows you to use your OpenAPI definition in a much more dynamic way, right? So if you're in phase 1, from Adrian's example earlier, if you're using the open source tools or maybe no tools at all, like I've talked to teams who have been storing their OpenAPI definitions in, a Word document or a spreadsheet, which in certain scenarios might be absolutely fine, but obviously that definition is a little bit more static, because you can't really plug a Word document into a code generator or something like that. Well, with SwaggerHub, you can, right? You use your OpenAPI definition becomes something dynamic that you can use to generate test cases. You can use it to generate server stubs, client SDKs. You can use it to update a gateway, for example. And all of that is incredibly powerful, but in terms of the standardization, you're making sure that before an API definition reaches the point where you're pushing it downstream and exposing it to a little bit more risk and chance in terms of what might happen to the API once it's being developed, it's already gone through certain checks and balances here, right? So if you're someone like Adrian said who's responsible for making sure that an API is meeting certain rules, by the time it gets to here, API standardization in SwaggerHub is potentially very, very powerful.
Okay, so
yeah,
I was
going
to say.
you first. This is the difficult thing. If I can't see it, I keep stepping on your toes. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say at the moment, we just have a poll that I'm just going to launch, and as we're launching this, we can touch on some of the questions that have come in.
Yes.
So I'm just launching this poll now, but this poll is just wondering if you're interested in learning more about how you can get started with SwaggerHub and that design process, and let's say the standardization and having that reusability and standardization within your design process for your APIs.
Yeah, exactly. Because we kind of, obviously, the clue is in the name of the webinar. We focus mainly on the standardization side of things in SwaggerHub, but there's a host of integrations there. There's more on the documentation side that we can look at. So if you're interested in seeing any more of that, absolutely let us know. So Pavel asked, is publishing a reversible process? So it is. It's really just a click of a button. In terms of, once an API is published, it does technically become read-only in SwaggerHub. but you can very easily unpublish an API, at the click of a button as well, depending on your requirements. I can click here and unpublish it. Again, who can actually do that? Defining some kind of sign-off process that could be approached using the different user types and user access roles in SwaggerHub. So you might say that only designers are able to publish or unpublish an API, or only an owner is able to do that. So it really depends on who needs to be able to sign off, or who needs to be able to actually say, yeah, this API is ready to go. But short answer is, yeah, it is certainly reversible.
And I believe with the registry API for SwaggerHub has been recently updated as well to allow publishing from, let's say, a CI pipeline. So if you want to do that from, let's say, a command line, you can kick that off.
Absolutely. So Laura had a specific question there about registry API functionality. Laura, we can certainly find out. I admit I don't know off the top of my head what the situation is there with that particular functionality being made available through the API. But if you get in touch with us after this, obviously it sounds like you're a current user of SwaggerHub. Either get in touch with us or your account manager, and we can certainly find out for you what the story is there. Because I know there's quite regular updates to the registry API functionality, so we can certainly find out for you, Laura. So Shashank has asked, what are best practices to manage implementation specific code in tool generated service stub? So Shashank, I won't lie to you, it's probably not something that we'll be able to cover in the next couple of minutes before the webinar ends, but this is something that we'd be happy to, to have a longer conversation with you or your team about, if you do want us to get in touch and maybe have a slightly longer demo of SwaggerHub specific to what you're doing with it or what you need to do with it, where the code gen piece is concerned. So by all means, if you do want to have that longer conversation, absolutely get in touch and we can take it from there.
Okay, I'm just going to close the poll now at the moment. Thank you to everybody for answering that.
And sorry, I might just jump in there. So John Cody has actually maybe realized there's probably one thing that is definitely worth covering in terms of standardization that I hadn't mentioned yet. So John asked, can model definitions be shared across different specifications? All right, so the short answer is yes, they can. And that's what I referred to earlier on that I said I would circle back on, but I did not, so forgive me. That's domains, right? So you can see, Joe Joyce is logged in here. He's got all these API definitions that he has access to. There's also a domain here. And a domain is the YAML file with a lot of those reusable components in it. So as you said, John, if you had, if you're using SwaggerHub, chances are you're close to, you're in phase 2 or phase 3 of what we looked at earlier. You're probably talking about a lot of different APIs that more than likely share similar, data models or examples or sample parameters and responses. You might want to implement some kind of inheritance where you don't necessarily need to, from scratch, write that YAML in every API that needs it. So you can use a domain to store these common models or common responses, and you reference them like this. So if I wanted to reference, this response, for example, or this error model in another API definition, you use something like this. So the $ref with the open inverted commas, and then the path to that model. And then if you use an external reference in another API definition, as far as SwaggerHub is concerned, and as far as the definition is concerned, that's the YAML that's included in that domain. And that's a big part of standardization in SwaggerHub as well, is that you want to make sure that there is a standard way of implementing a particular data model. There's a standard way of implementing a particular request or response. So domains are a way to do that. So thanks for the reminder, John.
Okay, I know we're kind of running up on the hour mark, and there is a couple of questions left now. We might be able to get to all those questions, but we will be able to get in contact with you afterwards in order to help provide answers and more information to you. So from my side, I'd just like to thank Joe for running through the demonstration, and just want to thank everybody for attending as well. It was great to see such a great attendance and people from loads of different countries and locations attending. So just thanks to everybody. And once again, if you want to learn more about SmartBear or about SwaggerHub, just feel free to contact us and we'll be able to go through the tool in a bit more detail.
Absolutely. Thanks a million, Adrian, and thanks everyone for joining. Hopefully we'll speak to you all again soon.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody.